Well, this video looks different because it's nighttime at the Litt house and I'm needing to record the night before. But this is the big chapter, Chapter 18. We got in two cars. You can see my screen of my glasses. I'll try to avoid that. There we go. No, okay. We got in two cars to drive for an hour and a half north of Grand Rapids. We were headed to a dinky town called Mecosta. I got to ride with the band while Mr. Jimmy and Hermione Calloway and the instruments were riding in the Packard. Miss Thomas stayed back at Grand Calloway Station. Remember, that's the name of their house. I've been living with Miss Thomas and the band for about 7 days now, and this was my third road trip. The band was doing their next favorite thing to playing music. They were teasing each other and talking in the back about Herman Calloway behind his back. The thug said to Dirty Deed, "I'd be offended, man, and I ain't trying to say that you ain't no good on the 88s, but you know the only reason you got this gig is because you're Dutch, you're white, and you don't have the strongest personality in the world." Deed said, "Yeah, well, such is life. You think I'm going to give up the best gig in the state just because I'd be offended? Take a look out the window, baby. There's a depression going on. How many folks you see living like us, Negro or white? Not many. That man may have his faults, but he's a struggler. I'm putting in my hat with him." Eddie looked at me and said, "Bud, Mr. C always has a white fella in the band, and it's for practical reasons. But we don't hold his skin color against him. He just can't help it. He was born that way." Deed said, "You're too kind, Edward." Eddie kept talking. "We do that because the boy can play, and Mr. C won't compromise on his music." I said, "But why does he always keep one white guy in the band?" Deed said, "Well, it's the way of the world right now, Sleepy. It's against the law for a Negro to own property out here where the log cabin is, so Mr. C has to put it in my name," said Dirty Deed. Eddie said, "Well, that and a lot of times we get gigs playing polkas and waltzes, and a lot of these white folks wouldn't hire us if they knew we were a Negro band. So Deed goes out and sets up everything. But what do they do when the Dusky Devastators show up? Well, it's too late for them to say anything. Then it's us or no music. And actually, a few times, Mr. C has told them if they ain't the best band they ever heard, then they don't have to pay. We haven't been stiffed yet." With all the arguing and jokes about Mr. C, the road trip seemed real short. So that conversation was very telling, wasn't it? You know, about how he can't own property, about how Herman Calloway is earning money, and they are. This is like a special spot in the Great Migration for these people, the band. They are truly a middle-class people with able to express themselves and live in a way that a lot of other people are not right now. Bud's lucky. I heard the band play and practiced 1,000 times, and we still had to sit on my hands when they were finished so I wouldn't bust out clapping. We finished our set at a little place called the Laughing Jack, and I got to sleep right on stage, actually, at the end of the night and guard the instruments. I slept there all night. The next morning, I was packing up everything into the cases when I got some bad news. Herman Calloway told Jimmy, "I'm going to stay and I'm going to catch up with Eugene. You head back with the boys." Oh, the man who owned the club was Eugene Miller, and he used to be in Mr. C's band. Jimmy said, "Bud, you take your time loading everything to the Packard. You're going to have to ride back with Herman." Uh-oh. Me and Mr. C looked at each other like this is not a good idea. He said, "Whatever," and he walked back to the club's office. Shucks, a whole hour and a half trapped in a car with Herman Calloway. I loaded all the instruments into the Packard and I sat on a big rock and I took out my recorder to practice. I could see Mr. C and Mr. Miller talking and laughing. He came out at last and he walked over to the side of the building and he started nudging the ground with his toe. I watched what he was doing. When I got next to him, I could see he was just pushing rocks around. He grunted a couple of times and started to bend over as his big belly got in the way. And he wouldn't let his arms reach the ground. "Make yourself useful, boy. Grab me this one." "What, sir? That stone." Right at the end of Mr. C's shiny brown shoe was a little rock. I bent over to pick it up, and I blew some dirt over it, and I turned it over a couple of my hands to see why he thought it was special. The only thing I could tell is he'd picked up a perfect throwing rock. The same kind of exact rock that I would have used if I was going to chuck somebody in the head. I dropped it into his hand. He didn't look at it or nothing. He stuck it in his pocket, and I heard it bang against up some silver dollars. I kept my nose out of the business for a long time, but then I had to say, "Mr. C, wasn't that just a rock?" "Sure was." Now, there was a million ways to ask what I wanted to know, and I chose the worst one. I said, "Well, what in the Sam hell are you going to do with the doggone rock?" It sounded a lot meaner than I wanted to, but I was really surprised that Mr. C wanted an old rock. He climbed in on one side of the Packard, and I climbed in on another. Packard's a car, remember? After he stuck his key in the dashboard, he said, "It's just a bad habit." Then he leaned over toward me and he opened the glove box of the car. There weren't any gloves or maps, just a bunch of perfect throwing rocks, and they had writing on them. I reached in and I took one of the rocks out. Written on the back was Idlewild, M5236. That means Idlewild, Michigan, May 2nd, 1936. I took out another one that said Preston Inn, 6436. That means Preston, Indiana, June 4th, 1936. It's 1936 now, I think. These were just like my rocks. They were like my rocks. I took one out that said Chicago Ill, 3/1932. That was 4 years ago. I looked over at Mr. C and I said, I have some of these. That's all he said. No, really. I have some too. He looked at me and he shifted his pipe away from the talking side of Mr. C. He goes, Bud, I know you're not the sharpest knife in the drawer, and I hate to be the bearer of tidings, but they're found all over the world. In fact, they're common as rocks, because they're rocks. I didn't answer him since I didn't want to look stupid. And I said, yes, sir, but mine have writing on them. And numbers, too. That's all he said, and he kept driving. You don't believe me, I'll show you. I dropped his 3 rocks in the glove box, and I climbed over the front seat to get at my sax case in the back. I found it, and I sat on the back seat, I unlocked it. I climbed back over the front seat, and I kept the rocks covered in my hand. If he was going to see them, he was going to have to wait. He was going to have to ask first. I crossed my arms and I waited and waited. It's a good thing I got a lot of patience because I waited a long time. We finally even got back to Grand Calloway Station. Mr. Jimmy helped us unload the car. Finally decided Mr. C had waited long enough. I said, see, I told you. I have rocks like these. The only difference is mine says Flint M.8.11.11 and Gary in.6.13.12. He said, where did you find those? Didn't I tell you not to do any rummaging around in that room you've been sleeping in? He reached for the rocks, and I don't know why, but I let him take them. He was the first person other than Bugs I'd ever let touch the rocks that my mom had given to me. He turned the rocks over and over in his hand. He said, well, where'd you get those? I could tell by the way he held my rocks. He was not giving them back. I kept watching his hand, waiting for my chance to snatch my rocks and get out of there. If I could get my hands back on my rocks, I knew I could outrun Mr. C, even though he was a lot stronger and his legs were longer than mine. Herman Calloway said, answer me, where did you take these from? Mr. C sounded meaner than he had ever sounded before. Jimmy heard him, and he put down the box he was carrying, and he walked over to us quick. Herman Calloway and the rock squeezed tight in his right hand fist, and his left fist was balled up like he was ready to fight. Herman, said Jimmy, what's this? What's wrong? He stood between me and Mr. C. I told you this boy from the word go. He's been snooping around things in the house he's got no business being in. He stole these. No, sir, I did not. Mr. C said, well, then where'd you get them? I'm not going to ask you again. He unsqueezed the rocks in his hands, and I was surprised that he hadn't even turned them into diamonds or dust. He'd been holding them so tight. Mr. Jimmy took my 2 rocks from him. He looked at the writing and he said, Flint, Michigan, August 8th, 1911. Gary, Indiana, July 13th, 1912. That's more than 25 years ago, Herman. He squatted down. He looked at me and said, son, where'd you find these? Please, just tell the truth. I kept one eye on Mr. C, and he looked like he was getting ready to jump funny on me. I said, Mr. Jimmy, I did not find them or I did steal them from nowhere. They have always been mine. I got them from my mama, and I swear the for God truth, not going to have my rocks back, sir. I stuck my hand out. Both Jimmy and Herman Calloway said, your mama? Yes, sir, and I kept my hand out. Bud, where did your mama get these? Sir, I don't know. She's always had them. Mr. Jimmy and Herman Calloway looked at me with that can't decide which hand to smack you with look, and Mr. Jimmy said, Bud, what did you say your mama's name was? Well, no one's ever asked me, sir. Herman Calloway was still hot. He goes, you throw a lot of sirs around, but you got a real strong, smart-mouth, disrespectful streak in you, boy. Now answer the question, or I screamed at him, Angela! Sir. I was so mad that I hadn't meant to say sir. It came out anyway. Her name was Angela Janet Caldwell. Herman Calloway's pipe dropped out of his mouth. He stumbled and he fumbled into Grand Calloway Station, feeling his way like he'd been struck blind. Then I knew. Herman Calloway was the best liar in the world. He'd been lying to me and everybody all along. Now there's some good proof that he was all shook up. I said to Mr. Jimmy, I knew it. I knew he was my father. Mr. Jimmy crouched down right in front of me and said, Bud, he's not your father. Yes, sir, he is. Why'd he run off like that? He got caught lying after all these years. Mr. Jimmy said, Bud, that is enough. Herman is not your father, but Angela Janet is his daughter's name. If what you're saying is true, Lord help us, it looks like Herman might be your grandfather. Well, that was real surprising, but the thing I felt most was glad, because Herman Calloway wasn't my dad. Shucks, who'd want a daddy that was being so old and so doggone mean had such a big belly? Not me. All right, chapter 19 unfolds much more truths. There's still another 22 pages of this book because they really put a cap on things. But now we know. Herman Calloway, he came all across the state to try to really, because his life was not good, and to find Herman Calloway and maybe some safety, and he did, but it turns out Herman Calloway is his grandfather, and his mother, Angela Janet, is Herman Calloway's daughter. Bing! Okay, I'm going to upload this now for the morning, and there is more.